Yay. Okay. And we're going to go with that. All right. So today we are starting with chapter 20 and the Renaissance motet. Last time we talked about madrigal, which is secular in nature. The motet is the sacred companion of the madrigal. Remember, madrigals are polyphonic, and they deal with lighthearted, usually love poetry. So the motet is also polyphonic, usually in four or more parts, but it deals with sacred themes. So it's polyphony for the church. So let's listen to a bit of this Josquin des Prez motet, Ave Maria Virgo Serena. Hail Mary, Virgin Serene. So you can definitely hear the vocal parts. Okay. If you hear the odd meowing, that's my cat Simon. Stop right there because we'll listen to the full recording here shortly. So, Renaissance sacred music was generally performed a cappella. Remember, that means without instrumental accompaniment. And it means for the chapel. So it was not considered proper to use instruments in church at this time. Some works are built on a fixed pre-existing melody, which was called the cantus firmus. Sometimes these melodies came from plain chant. Sometimes they came from secular sources as time kind of marched on and we became a little more progressive in our music choices. Sometimes that's going to get people into trouble because the cantus firmus they're going to choose is frankly not real appropriate for church use, but they thought they could get away with it and they couldn't. This motet we were just listening to is a motet to the Virgin Mary, and it's set in a polyphonic style. Here's an example of a Renaissance painting that you've probably seen many times before. This is called The Last Supper by Da Vinci. If you yeah, Simon says. If you remember some of the earlier paintings we saw, you can see how we're progressing in realism. The people actually look like people, and there's some perspective there. You can see the depth of the room. It's strange to me to think that that didn't always exist, that, you know, things like perspective in visual art had to be created and figured out, but they did. They had to be created and figured out, which I find really kind of interesting. Here's some other examples of some sacred art of the time featuring Mary and the baby Jesus. And then here's Mary and the baby Jesus surrounded by many angels keeping watch over them. New ways of thinking were beginning to take root in the Renaissance as opposed to the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages was really, especially in the church, was focused on the afterlife and how things were going to be better once we had died and gone to heaven. Frankly, that's because life here on earth wasn't all that great for most people. Unless you had a lot of money, you probably didn't have all that pleasant a life in the Middle Ages. But in the Renaissance, we began to think about life here on earth and how to make it more pleasant and more enjoyable. This awakening is called humanism. And it was inspired partially by Greek and Roman philosophers, by their writers and by their artworks. Remember, we brought back a lot of writing and scrolls when we came back from the Crusades. And once we began to translate those scrolls and then publish them in printed form and other people read them, people began to think, maybe it's okay to enjoy ourselves while we're here and alive rather than just suffering all the time and then waiting to have a good time after we're dead. Humanism is going to take hold in every aspect of Renaissance life. And music is certainly no exception to that. Music is to be enjoyed and shared, not just for the church, but for secular purposes too. The use of secular music in the home is going to spread and become more common. Remember, we could publish books at this time. So if you were a middle-class person, if you had a little more money, you would be able to afford your own music books that you could have at home to use for your own personal enjoyment. In addition to Gregorian chant, remember that's plain chant, which is monophonic in texture. That defined Catholic prayer, but music for services also included hymns, motets, which we're talking about right now, and polyphonic settings of the Catholic Mass. Remember, at this time, this is before the Protestant Revolution and the Reformation, which is going to take place later in the Renaissance. So right now, the Catholic Church is the only game in town. If you're going to attend a Christian church, it's going to be Catholic. Normally, motets were multi-voiced, and they were based on pre-existing music. Remember, we talked about the Cantus Firmus. They were sung by male singers. Women were not allowed to sing in church at this time. In fact, the congregation itself was not allowed to sing in church at this time. Only the choir and the cantors would sing. And so the soprano and alto parts were sung by boys whose voices had not yet changed. And if you had a little boy who had a particularly beautiful voice, you would probably send him to live and learn at the cathedral school so that he could become a singer in the church choir until his voice had changed. And then if his voice quality was good enough after it changed, he would stay on as a tenor or a bass. But this was a good opportunity for these little boys to get an education along with becoming a good musician. They also taught them how to read and write. They taught them about philosophy. They taught them about art. They taught them about mathematics. And not everybody at this time gets the opportunity to do that. Public school is still not a thing. You still have to have money to get a true education. It's easier to become a tradesman than it is to get a formal education as we think of a formal education now. The 16th century is regarded now as the golden age of the a cappella style, which is music for voices without instrumental accompaniment. Polyphony in motets and madrigals was based on imitation. Imitation is where you present a melodic idea, and then the other vocal parts imitate that or kind of echo it back. Sometimes it's at a higher or lower pitch level so that it creates harmony, but it's like if you sang, Mary had a little lamb, and then the tenor would come in with that after you, and then the bass would come in, and then the alto would come in. And you're going to pass that melodic idea around the vocal parts. This is, it's different from a true canon or a true round in that imitation is similar but not identical. It's going to change a little bit. One way is to alter the pitch level. Another way is to change the rhythm or the length of the notes. I'm not going to talk about open fifths. You don't really need to know that specific stuff. An open fifth is the distance between, say, a do in a scale and a sol in a scale above it. And an open fifth is a very open harmony. And they started filling in those open fifths with the third of the triad to make the harmony more rich. We tend to think of chords as being a do, mi, sol stack. And the Renaissance is when that sort of came into use and into fruition. Polyphonic writing let composers do lots of cool stuff because they used the cantus firmus and then they built on top of it, kind of like a Lego table and Legos. You could add the imitation, and you could also change things up with the soprano part being higher and maybe having more of the text, where the alto and tenor and bass usually carried the cantus firmus. The bass usually sang the fixed melody, and then the other three parts elaborated on that, with the soprano usually being the most florid of those and the most melismatic of those. Josquin des Prez was a master of the motet. He's one of the writers that we remember most strongly from the Renaissance period. He's one of the people who put his name on stuff. Remember, not everybody put their name on stuff. Some people would sign their compositions in Soli Deo Gloria, to God alone be the glory. But Josquin, he signed his stuff. He wanted to be sure his name got out there. Many motets praise the Virgin Mary or are based on texts about her, because Mary is a very important figure in the Catholic Church, being the mother of Jesus. Religious groups all over Europe were devoted to Mary, not as a worship figure, but as an advocate. The Catholics believe that if you pray and you invoke Mary's name, that she will speak directly to the Father and help your prayers be answered in a positive way. The fact that mother-child relationship between her and Jesus was very important and very powerful imagery for early Catholics. The preeminent composers of motets from the Renaissance were Josquin in Belgium and northern France. And Northern Europe at this time, instead of Southern Europe like Italy, the northern part of Europe was where the cool stuff was happening, Belgium and France, as opposed to Italy. Italy is a little more set in their ways when it comes to motet and polyphonic music. They tended to stick to things that were more monophonic in texture. So here is a what we believe is a picture of Josquin. He is known for a powerful influence on the next generation of composers. If you notice, I scrolled past it, but Martin Luther, who is the leader of the Lutheran Reformation, hence the name Lutheran in his name, has this little quote praising Josquin. Josquin is the master of notes. They have to do as he bids them. Other composers have to do as the notes will. So that's pretty high praise coming from Martin Luther, who wrote a lot of hymn texts. Josquin spent his youth in Northern Europe, and then he migrated to Italy, as many people did, to kind of build himself a career in music, in the courts in Milan and Ferrara. And he was also in the papal choir in Rome. Now, that's a big deal. That's the Pope's very own choir, and that's a pretty good gig. So while he was in Italy, he absorbed all these other classical influences from both the secular and the sacred realms. And then he kind of created something a little bit new and some really beautiful stuff. His major works are over 100 motets and at least 17 masses. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but you have to realize that they would write these masses sometimes fresh every week. Next week in the church calendar is Palm Sunday. Well, let's have a new mass for Palm Sunday. Josquin, whip us up a mass, and he would do that. So 17 may not sound like a big number, but it's a pretty big deal. He also wrote secular chansons and Italian secular madrigals. Here's a group of singers using a choir book. See how they're all reading from the same big book? So they're all kind of gathered around. And here's the composer with his spectacles on. I feel his pain. Okay. So the motet we were just listening to, Ave Maria Virgo Serena, is a prime example of how Josquin experimented with combinations of voices and textures to make the text more emotional and create an emotional connection with the listener. It's a 4-voice composition, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. And the high voices engage in a dialogue with the lower ones, with imitative textures And so it's going to go back and forth between being a little more back and forth call and response, question answer kind of singing, and to homorhythmic where everybody moves together, where you move in block chords. When the composer switches to those block chord moments, it it kind of brings out what's being said or sung about because everyone's saying the same thing at the same time. So it's very clearly understandable. And that makes a big difference. If you think about being in a room where a bunch of different conversations are going on all at once, but then everybody stops and says the Pledge of Allegiance together, that Pledge of Allegiance would be the homorhythmic setting part of the motet because everyone's saying the same thing at the same time and it's clearly understandable, and it's very easy to well understand. I don't know how to say that. So let's listen to, now I'm gonna have to make this smaller so I can switch screens because it's being really dopey tonight, and we'll use this for our book because I do like how it lays things out for us. So let's listen to the Ave Maria. Make sure we can see. I'm sorry, this thing is in the way and I'm not being successful at getting it to move. Let me try to see if I can pull it up here. Okay, maybe that'll work. Okay. So there you can hear the voices imitating what the sopranos began with. Hear how that text just pops out. So we're headed toward a cadence, which is a resting point, a musical resting point. It really is beautiful. can see by the text why he would want this to be homorhythmic. This is a very important thing. Okay, so motet is the sacred companion to madrigal and chanson, which are secular in nature. The motet is polyphonic, but it's set to texts that are sacred in nature. Josquin des Prez being one of the leading composers of motet in this Renaissance period. And we just listened to that elsewhere. So now let's talk about music for the Mass. The Mass is the Catholic order of worship. There are different Masses for different times of the year. There are some things that stay the same all the time, and there are things that change depending on what season of the year you're in. Like I mentioned, that next week on the Christian calendar is Palm Sunday. So right now we're in the season of Lent, which is a season of preparation for Palm Sunday and then eventually Easter, when we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. The week between Palm Sunday and Easter is Holy Week, when Jesus rides into Jerusalem. That's Palm Sunday, and all the people greet him and are really excited that he's there. And in just a week's time, just from Sunday to Friday, by Friday, they're going to be so upset with him that they kill him. So, famous fleeting. And then he's buried, and then on Sunday he rises again, and that's the basis of the Christian faith. So there are special prayers, songs, and liturgy that goes along with Lent, with Palm Sunday, with Holy Thursday, which is when Jesus celebrated his Last Supper with his disciples, and then Friday, which is Good Friday, when he is crucified and dies and is buried before sundown, because then the next day is the Sabbath for Jews, and they couldn't have done anything on Saturday because it's not okay to do that. And then he rises on Sunday. So here's just a little snippet of the Pope Marcellus Mass by Palestrina, who is another very important composer of the Renaissance period. Now, that's not really a cadence, but I'll make it one. Notice how, because of the homorhythmic setting that Palestrina chose to use, the words are clear and understandable. He's not really using any imitation at this point. It's really, but it's not quite block chord. Palestrina is one of my favorite Renaissance composers. I just think he's brilliant. The most solemn ritual of the Catholic Church is the Mass, which is a daily service. Most Catholics go to Mass weekly, but if you are in the service of the church, you celebrate Mass daily. You do it every day. And there are two categories of prayers: the ordinary, that stay the same all the time, and then the proper, that changes from season to season or depending on feast days. Renaissance composers set texts from the ordinary of the Mass: the Kyrie, the Gloria, the Credo, the Sanctus, and the Agnus Dei. Kyrie is Christ have mercy, Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy. The Gloria in excelsis Deo. We think of that as a Christmas thing, but it's not really just a Christmas thing. That's a text that's used throughout the year. Credo is I believe. We believe in God the Father Almighty, etc. Sanctus is behold the Lamb of God who was no, I'm sorry, that's Agnus Dei. Agnus Dei is behold the Lamb of God who was slain. That's just before the communion is served. So those, it makes sense that they would set a lot of prayers from the ordinary because it's done weekly or, daily, depending on what your job is. Reformers such as Luther and Calvin believe that monophonic congregational singing in vernacular should define Christian worship. Luther is the leader of the Lutheran Church, and John Calvin is also a Protestant figure, important in particular the Presbyterian Church. And they're going to lead revolts against Catholicism and against things like the congregation not being able to sing. Luther and Calvin believe that worship should be experienced from a personal standpoint and that everybody needs to get in on the act. The Catholics are going to continue to rely on trained singers and polyphony. And they're not, the congregation in the Catholic Church isn't going to sing until, frankly, the 20th century. It's going to be a long time before the Catholic Church is going to begin to have ordinary people in the pews sing. Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina is one of the important composers, specifically of music for the Mass. We heard just a bit of his Pope Marcellus Mass, named for the Pope at the time, Marcellus. The Pope Marcellus Mass met the demands of the Council of Trent, which was a big meeting of the Catholic Church, saying, here are the things that are going well. Here are the things that we don't think are going well. How are we going to fix these things? And Palestrina kind of came in and sort of cleaned up the act of what was going on with polyphony at the time. Remember, I mentioned that sometimes they would choose things for the Cantus Firmus, which were from secular songs that were frankly not real appropriate for a church setting. And as the higher ups began to catch on to this, they put their foot down and said, yeah, you can't do that. Okay, this got to be church appropriate, or we're not going to be using this as a Cantus Firmus. And Palestrina came in and sort of cleaned up the way that we were writing polyphony. He made it more understandable. He made it more respectful and more acceptable to the church leaders, because it was more in line with what they thought polyphony should be like. They were ready to do away with polyphony altogether and say, nope, we're just going to go back to plain chant because we really can't trust you composers. You guys are out of control. But Palestrina came in and sort of saved polyphony. We call him the savior of Catholic polyphony. And in some ways it is true. Come on. Okay. So here we are in the 1500s. We've come a long way. We've come about 500 years from where we started a couple of weeks ago. The Protestants are going to say that we should have simple unity, simple monophonic congregational singing, because it's clear and understandable, and it should be done in vernacular so everybody can sing. Remember, Catholics are still singing in Latin. They're still preaching in Latin. They're still doing everything in Latin. So unless you speak Latin, you may not be getting quite as much out of your Mass attendance as you could if, you're a German Lutheran and you go to worship and everything's in German. You're going to understand it a whole lot better. The Mass is a reenactment of Christ's Last Supper, which I mentioned earlier as being Holy Thursday. We call it communion in the Christian church. In the Jewish faith, it's called the Seder. And the Seder is celebrated during Passover time. And there are questions and answers that are presented. There are certain foods that are eaten, and Jesus used this moment to kind of tell his disciples, "Hey, I'm going out. I'm going to be betrayed by one of the people who are sitting right here sharing this meal with me. I'm going to die, and I'm going to rise again." So the Christian church celebrates that as a remembrance of Christ's sacrifice. The Catholic Church specifically celebrates that as the Mass. We've talked about the ordinary, we've talked about the proper. Kyrie is actually a Greek text. The words are Greek in origin. Kyrie, Christ have mercy. But the rest of the Mass is in Latin. So the way that the Mass goes is on certain Sundays we have a proper of an introit, which is kind of an entry, an introduction to what's going to happen, and then we have the Kyrie. My cat is throwing a fit. Sorry, I'm moving my book so he can get on my lap if he wants. Here's a Kyrie. Kyrie eleison. Notice this is monophonic in texture, so it's very easy to understand. Christ eleison, Christ have mercy. So it returns to the Kyrie eleison. So it's Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, Lord have mercy. So 3 parts. Remember that 3 is a very important number in Christianity. 3 reflects the Trinity. This Kyrie says the Kyrie 3 times, then says the Christe 3 times, and then says the Kyrie 3 times. So it's 3 times 3. Simple, understandable. And then you have the Gloria. We heard a little bit of this before, or we heard part of the Pope Marcellus Mass before. Gloria in excelsis Deo, glory to God in the highest. And on earth, peace, goodwill to men. Okay, you know what? We're gonna listen to that from the other one so you can see the words. So after the Gloria, we have a gradual. Now this is part of the proper. So you not every week, not every time would you have a gradual or an Alleluia. Alleluias, for instance, are not to be sung during Lent. So if you went to a mass during this season, you would not have an Alleluia because that's not considered, it's considered too celebratory for the Lenten season. Then you have the Credo, which is the I believe in God the Father Almighty, etc. Then you have an offertory. The Sanctus is Holy, Holy, Holy Lord, God of power and might. And then the Agnus Dei is Behold the Lamb that was slain. Then they present the communion, which is literally the lamb that was slain. And all this says exactly what I just said. So we'll move on. Now, not everybody was down with this. Martin Luther was a Catholic priest who decided that he had some complaints about what was going on in the Catholic Church. And he thought, you know, it's time to switch it up. We need to have some reforms. So he literally wrote down his 95 theses, a list of 95 things that he thought should be done differently. And he literally nailed them to the door of the church in Wittenberg, where he was a monk. And he did this, if I remember correctly, on what we now think of as Halloween in the year 1517. And the Catholic Church rewarded his hard work and his big ideas by excommunicating him and saying, you are no longer a priest and you're no longer affiliated with the Catholic Church. So Luther said, okay, I'll go create my own church. So he went off and created his own church, which we now call the Lutheran Church. There are many similarities between the Lutheran Church and the Catholic Church. And that makes sense because Luther was essentially a Catholic priest with complaints. One of the big things that he thought should be different was that the congregation should sing. He also thought that worship should be conducted in vernacular so that if you were in Germany, your service was in German so you could understand. If you were in France, your service should be in French so that you can understand. That makes sense to us today. But at the time, it was a very radical notion, very, very radical notion. And that's one of the things that got him excommunicated. John Calvin was another reformer who is now Protestant. The Protestant church was born out of protest. See the similarity? And somebody else that's going to latch onto this idea and use it for his own purposes is King Henry VIII in England. He's going to create the Church of England so that he can divorce his wives instead of cutting off their heads all the time. it seemed easier to him. So he created the Church of England, which we now think of as the Anglican Church, or the Episcopal Church. They're both branches of the same tree. He created that during the time of the Reformation so that he could divorce his wives. He did have a whole bunch of them. So all these people come in and reform the church for variously cynical reasons. King Henry being the one that his reasoning was probably the most cynical. But everybody that opened up the world of the church to people to whom, frankly, it wasn't real accessible before. Being able to celebrate and to worship in vernacular is a big deal. It's important. If you're going to go, and I've been to church services in various countries in Europe. Germany comes to mind, and we attended a worship service, and of course the sermon was in German. So let's just say I didn't get a whole lot out of that sermon because I don't speak enough German to have followed that sermon closely. So I can really get behind what they're saying, that it's important that we are able to celebrate in our own language. Being a singer, it's also special to me that everybody's able to sing. And that's not going to happen in the Catholic Church for a while still. We're not there yet. This is going to open up music to folks like J.S. Bach, who we will talk about when we get to Baroque music next week, who is going to be an incredibly important composer in the Baroque period. And he wrote mostly for the Lutheran Church. So the Catholic Church was undergoing its own turmoil right now because all these churches were breaking away and creating their own denominations with their own sets of rules and doing things in their own way. That was called the Counter-Reformation. The Protestant Reformation was Luther and Calvin, and to a lesser extent, Henry VIII. The Counter-Reformation takes place in the Catholic Church itself. When you go through a period of turmoil, it's good to step back and kind of take a look at yourself and say, why is this happening? Is there something I could do to make it better, or maybe kind of fix it or improve things? And that was the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent was the longest Zoom meeting ever. It went from 1545 to 1563. That's a long meeting. That's a very long meeting. It could not have been an email. No, it could not have been, because there was too much that happened at the Council of Trent. They were trying to regulate every aspect of religious discipline, which is a tall order because there are a lot of rules in every denomination, but especially in the Catholic Church. And the Council of Trent did take up the matter of church music. The attending cardinals are, high important people in the Catholic Church, not just baseball players. The attending cardinals noted that the corruption of traditional chants by singers, adding a lot of melismas and embellishments to the melodies that had been very simple. They didn't like the use of instruments in religious services. Remember, everything had been a cappella, and now we were starting to use instruments, and they didn't think that was proper. And the incorporating of popular secular songs in masses. So secular music was creeping into sacred music, and in many ways kind of corrupting it and polluting it. And they did not like that. And the generally irreverent attitude of church musicians, heaven forbid. So in polyphonic settings in the Mass, the sacred text was getting kind of lost because there was so much going on in the polyphony. It was hard to understand. And they needed it to be cleaner. They needed it to be more respectful. They needed it to be more church appropriate. And they thought about just going back to Gregorian chant and getting rid of polyphony altogether. And that would have been a real shame. But fortunately, cooler heads prevailed and said, no, let's not get rid of it. Let's just fix it. Let's make it better. Let's make it more what we want. Let's tell composers that it needs to be the vocal parts need to be more understandable. It needs to be more respectful. It needs to be based on sacred chant instead of secular popular music. Enter Giovanni Pierluigi di Palestrina. Palestrina is named for the town where he was born. He was born in Palestrina. And he was an organist and a choir master at a bunch of Italian churches, including St. Peter's in Rome, which is a wonderful place. If you ever make it to Rome, please be sure you go to St. Peter's. It is an amazing cathedral, just light and colorful and beautiful. It's kind of the opposite of Notre Dame, which I mentioned, I think last week, is probably my favorite cathedral in the world. St. Peter's is the opposite of Notre Dame. Notre Dame is very dark and very Gothic, and St. Peter's is very light and very colorful. So it's two sides of the same coin. They're both wonderful, wonderful places. So I hope you get to visit there if you have not already. He was at St. Peter's for 23 years, which is a long time. It's a long time. And he wrote largely sacred music, and he wrote more masses really than anybody else. His music represents a pure a cappella style of vocal polyphony. So no instrument muddying up his masses. It's going to be voices only. And he wanted them to be very understandable so he could meet the guidelines of the Council of Trent and try to make everybody happy. He wrote over 100 masses, including the Pope Marcellus Mass, which we've heard a little bit of and we're going to hear a little bit more of. And he also wrote madrigals and motets. Remember, madrigals are secular. So it's not that he didn't have any fun. He did. He also wrote motets. So the Pope Marcellus Mass was thought to have been written to satisfy the Council of Trent, but that may or may not be true. The papal choir sang without instrumental accompaniment, and this mass was most likely performed a cappella. It's written for 6 vocal parts: soprano, alto, remember those would have been young boys, 2 tenor parts, and 2 bass parts, which was a typical setting for all male church choirs of the era. The highest voice was sung by boy sopranos or male falsettists, which are men who sing only in their falsetto voice, and the alto part by male altos or countertenors, who are tenors with a very high voice, who also sing in almost a falsetto. The Gloria exhibits Palestrina's hallmark style. It's restrained, it's serene, it's celestial, it's beautiful. The opening line, Gloria in excelsis Deo, glory be to God on high, is chanted by the officiating priest. So you hope you have a priest who can sing. For the remaining text, the setting is polyphonic. And balancing homophonic and polyphonic spots makes that text pop out, like we talked about before. We talked about that already. Okay. So let's hear. Uh-oh. Can I get there? I don't know. Here we go. Okay, let's hear some of the Gloria from the Pope Marcellus Mass. If I can get there. Here we go. Okay. Okay, so now what can I do with this to get out of here? This is the pain. Okay. So here is the Gloria in excelsis Deo. This is what it would look like in the pneumatic notation of the time. Remember, this is going to be chanted by the officiating priest, and it's monophonic, so it's very easy to understand. Then that's elaborated on Notice as we're listening and reading, you can clearly understand what they're saying. That's one of the things the Council of Trent really wanted to have happen, was that if we're going to keep the polyphony, we've got to be able to understand what they're saying. Stay Lamb of God. Sorry, that was a mistake. Huh. Okay, there it is. Okay, that was a mistake. All right, let me see if I can move this, and maybe not. Okay. Okay, so we just listened to that in a different form. Beautiful stuff. All right. So to round out our discussion of medieval and Renaissance music, we're going to talk about dance music. Dance music has often been groundbreaking and provocative in the Western tradition. Think about when we all started doing, well, maybe you're too young to remember, when everybody started doing the Macarena. That was a big deal. Dance crazes. Now everything's on TikTok, right? You go to TikTok to learn the latest dance craze, but that has been happening forever since humans started moving to beats we played on hollowed out logs. We have been dancing forever. Hopefully, we'll keep on dancing forever, and that the newest dance move, the newest dance craze, has been a touchstone, a flashpoint for us often in our human existence. Musical instruments in the medieval and Renaissance were used for were either soft, called bass instruments, or loud, haute instruments. And if you wanted the music to be soft and pleasant, you used bass instruments. If you wanted it to be loud and raucous, you used haute instruments, because it was difficult to achieve a soft sound on a haute instrument. It was difficult to achieve a loud sound on a bass instrument. So you had specific instruments for the specific dynamic level that you wanted to present. We just weren't to the point of manufacture yet when you could do both. You know, the reason we call a piano is because its full name is pianoforte, because it was capable of playing both soft and loud, depending on what you as a performer did to that instrument, how you played it. That was not always true. The instruments that were soft in nature were going to be soft, and there wasn't much you could do to make that sound louder. Both professional and amateur musicians played instrumental dance music and often added embellishments. They would change it up. They would add trills or melismatic passages to make it sound different and to create musical expression. Instrumental music was largely an oral tradition that relied on the improvisation skills of players. You learned it from someone else, and then you taught it to someone else. We weren't writing these things down for a while. It was passed on like the telephone game. So as we know, when we play the telephone game, after it's gone through several permutations, it's not exactly what it was when it started out at the beginning. It has probably become more embellished. It has probably become more florid than it was before as time moved on and people began to elaborate and improvise on the melody that they had learned. Instruments are still grouped into the same general categories that we have now. There were strings, woodwinds, brass percussion, and keyboard instruments. But remember, they were either bass, indoor kind of instruments, or haute, loud, outdoor kind of instruments. If you play haute instruments inside, it's going to be really loud. If you play bass instruments outdoors, they're not really going to be heard very well. So there were specific instruments for specific dynamic levels and for specific occasions and places. Among the most common soft instruments were the recorder, which we're familiar with. Most of us played plaster recorders when we were in elementary school, but the recorders of this time are wooden, and there were several different sizes. The lute, which was a plucked string instrument, which is a forerunner of our guitar now. We talked about lutes last week. And various bowed instruments, including the rebec. And you can see an illustration of that on page 70 of your book. Loud instruments, the haute instruments, were the shawm, which is an ancestor of the oboe. If you know what an oboe sounds like, it kind of sounds like a duck. The shawm was a duck on steroids. It was really, really loud and really, really nasal. It cut through outside just fine. The sackbut, which is an early brass instrument, which is an ancestor of the trombone. My high school band director named his dog Sackbut. Just a little trivia from me. And the cornetto, which was a wooden instrument with finger holes like a recorder, but it had a cup-shaped mouthpiece like our modern-day brass instruments. These loud instruments made up the Civic Wind Band, a group of 3 to 5 players that you could find in most towns. The band was often accompanied by percussion instruments like the tabor, which was a cylindrical drum, or nakers, which were small hand drums, kind of like bongos. Other brass instruments like trumpets would be used to highlight ceremonial grandeur. The king's coming in, blow the trumpets, or to scare the enemy when you were on the battlefield. That was also the original purpose of bagpipes. You put the bagpipers in the front, you started to march over the hill, and the enemy on the opposite side of the hill heard the bagpipes coming, and they were really loud and scary, and hopefully they would drop their swords and run away, and you wouldn't have to fight. Sometimes they were braver than that. Because of their construction and the fact that they played fanfares or other simple accompaniments, trumpets served mostly as sonic reinforcement at public events, and they're not going to have valves yet. You had to do all the note changes that you were going to do with your embouchure, with your mouth, so that you couldn't play a lot of melodies on these early trumpets because they're not capable of that. Now, if you look at this picture, you're going to see a bassoon, you're going to see some shawms, a cornetto, which I believe this is the cornetto, and here's a sackbut. And they're playing at a procession, so they are outside with their haute instruments. The first notated record of instrumental music comes from just a handful of dances in late medieval manuscripts. I think we talked about that last week. And then as printed music became more prevalent in the 16th century, books of dance music became readily available and more affordable. These publications included a wide variety of dance types, ranging from slow and stately things like the pavane to faster or showier things like the saltarello or the ronde. And the ronde was kind of a line dance. We think of line dances now being attached to country music in particular. So that concept's been around for a long time. Now, instruments weren't always specified. Like, it's not going to say in that book, this should be played on the shawm or this should be played on the lute. You could play it on whatever you had handy because, in my house, I may have a lute, but I may not have a shawm. So if it told me specifically I had to play the shawm, I may be out of luck. So it was kind of mix and match. You played what you had that was on hand and available. They published the most fashionable and popular dances. So we have a fairly good idea of what patterns of movements were considered attractive and trendy for young Europeans to try out. It was important as an educated person that you knew how to do these dances because that was part of being a member of polite society. So Susato, Salomon Susato, was a well-known printer and musician, and he was a jack of all trades. He wrote music and he also printed it so he could sell it. So he was something of an entrepreneur. And he composed and arranged several styles of secular and sacred works. So he was writing and producing dance music, but he was also producing and putting out sacred music. He's not hedging any bets here. And unlike modern musicians who tend to specialize on one particular instrument, he played pretty much everything. So he could write things that were playable by many different kinds of instruments, which again is an advantage. This latest talent gained him a position as a member of the Antwerp City Band. Remember that every town had its own little band, and this was the one in Antwerp in Belgium. They were a very well-known group of 5 instrumentalists who performed regularly at town concerts and for processions or parades held on religious occasions and for entertainment for visiting dignitaries. If the mayor of the town is coming to dinner, well, you want to be sure that you have music to entertain the mayor. So you would get the Antwerp City Band to come and play. The music this group played is not quite clear. We know they did not rely exclusively on notated music. They were master improvisers. And that comes with time and with working together. You know, if you work with a group of musicians long enough, you begin to understand how one another think, and it's easy to do things like improvisation and taking turns. That's why jazz became what it is, because we jazz musicians, after they work together for a while, you kind of understand how each other think. And if the trumpet takes a solo, it's called taking a ride. The trumpet takes a ride, then you know that probably the trombone is going to take the next ride, and you know that it's going to be, you know, between 16 and 32. It's going to be either 16 or 32 bars, and then the next person is going to take their turn. So that just comes with time and with familiarity. Susato's collection, called the Danzieri, features a variety of popular dance types, including 3 rondas that we're going to hear. These were originally a country dance, and it made its way to the city and to the courts of the nobility. As things often do, it trickles up. Our recording features loud civic-style wind bands, so haute instruments. The repeated dance sections allowed the musicians to improvise embellishments or musical directions as they saw fit. So again, kind of like jazz, they're taking a ride. The performers in our recording follow that custom, making sure the sound is enriched and varied through different combinations of instruments. And the dances flow from one to another. You know, once you, oh, good, my internet connection's unstable. That's awesome. As you begin to play, you know, everybody gets up and they start to dance. Well, you don't want the music to stop, because then people are going to get off the dance floor and you're probably not going to get paid. So you want to keep the music going. That's how our modern DJs do it, right? They flow one song into another to keep people on the dance floor. So that's a really old concept. So let's see if we can hear these dances. Okay, now I have to move this back over here so we can see. Okay, so here is dance 1. Now notice, if you just look at the chart up here, we're going to go from dance 1 right into dance 2, right into dance 3. So there's a sham. So the sham's laying down the boogie, and now everybody else comes in to join the sham. So here's dance 2, and it gets started by the cornetto. There's the sham. So you can imagine this. You can imagine people dancing to this. You can also imagine this as processional music while the lords and ladies are walking by and everyone's applauding, and, you know. Ta-da at the end. So they kind of invented the ta-da. I think that's fun to listen to. So here we see a picture of, oops, they disappeared. Some folks dancing in a circle dance. So they might be doing a ronda. And here are our musicians up here playing so that they have music to dance to. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our Renaissance section. Here's our Susato again, but we've already heard that. So this is kind of a wrap up of medieval and Renaissance styles. I'm not going to read this to you. It is in your book. So I would recommend taking a look at that just so you kind of have an idea, a broad idea of what we're talking about in the change from medieval to Renaissance. And so next time we'll be moving into the Baroque era. So what you need to do is scrolling down. Okay, hang on, let me move this over here so we can see what we're doing. Okay, so you need to do the Middle Ages and Renaissance quiz. It's an error quiz and a listening identification quiz. And this is found on Inquisitive. Okay. If you have still not yet registered your textbook, you really need to do that. I cannot put you in the student set until you have registered your code. If you're having trouble, Brock was having trouble with his code. He's contacting Norton. If you're having trouble and you follow those directions that I gave you a few weeks ago, and you're still having issues, I can try to help, but really, truly, Norton, the people that produce the book, are the folks that can help you the most. So if you're having trouble, contact me. But if I can't help you, contacting Norton is your next step. But this is what you need to do between now and next week. If you want to do 20, 21, and 22, just before you do the quiz, that's fine, but you don't have to. The quiz is the ultimate goal of this for this section. So this is due by next week. For those of you that are watching the recording, tonight's code word is proper, which is the set of prayers that change from in the Catholic Church. So to this week's code is proper. Okay, so I'll be looking for your scores on the Middle Ages and Renaissance era and listening identification quiz, which is found on Inquisitive. If you have any questions, as always, please let me know. And if not, hopefully I'll be teaching from Fredericktown next week. The student who comes in Fredericktown was sick this week, so I thought I would just teach from home. Hopefully that worked out okay for everybody, and Zoom seems to have behaved itself, which is good. So please let me know if I can help you in any way, and if not, I will see you next week.